At Voidwatch, we tell these stories the old way. No synthetic narrators, no generated voices, just a human reading a human story. If that matters to you, subscribe. My name is Theo, and let's begin. The chart hovering above the Sterilus Concordance assembly floor was rendered in clean antiseptic white. 10 glowing nodes arranged in a slow orbit around a central seal marked Plague Protocol Omega. To the assembled delegates, it was not a chart. It was an obituary for 10 worlds that had not yet died, written in advance by a species that had never been wrong about this particular subject in 11,000 years. Dr. Maya Okonkwo, seconded from Earth as its sole standing representative to the Concordance's Biohazard Directorate, watched the chart resolve into its final form. Designated reservoir worlds, ranked by confirmed pathogenic saturation. She felt the same thing she always felt in this chamber, the sensation of being the only person in the room who had ever actually been sick. She had been seconded here 4 months ago, after Earth's prior liaison, a soft-spoken virologist named Dr. Albrecht Voss, had suffered a fatal allergic reaction to a ceremonial incense used during a diplomatic welcome. Nobody on the Concordance side had thought to check what was in it. Nobody on Earth's side had thought to send a replacement with any particular urgency. Maya had been the nearest qualified body, and qualified, in this case, meant she had spent 15 years running infectious disease wards before transitioning into research. She understood pathogens. She understood, more specifically, what it felt like to lose. Director Pell of the Vesari stood beside the display, his elongated, translucent form catching the light in slow, shifting patterns. Every internal organ visible beneath the skin so clear it looked like poured glass. The Vesari had evolved on a world with almost no microbial life, a sterile crystalline planet, where the harshest biological threat in their evolutionary history had been a slow-growing lichen analog that posed no danger to anything. Their bodies had never developed an adaptive immune system in any form a human would recognize, because they had never needed one. Their civilization was built on assumption, bone deep and unquestioned, that biology, left unchecked, was a contamination event waiting to happen. The survey findings are conclusive. Director Pell began, his voice a thin, resonant hum, like glass vibrating at a frequency just below pain. The chamber's acoustics carried it to every corner without distortion. Representatives from 100-member worlds sat in silence, their attention fixed on the display. Long-range biological samplers have returned saturation data from each of these 10 reservoir worlds. Every reading confirms catastrophic, self-sustaining pathogenic ecosystems incompatible with the survival of any organized civilization. Under the authority of Plague Protocol Omega, these 10 systems will be sealed. No biological sampling, no atmospheric contact, no descent below the upper thermosphere in perpetuity. Maya set down the stylus she had been turning over her fingers. Plague Protocol Omega, a total biological lockdown, enforced by automated sterilization platforms that would incinerate anything attempting to leave the planet's atmosphere forever on the strength of a single survey. It was, she understood now, the harshest sanction Concordance possessed, harsher even than Protocol Gamma's environmental quarantines, because environmental hazards could theoretically be engineered around. Biological hazards, to the Vesari, were not engineering problems. They were existential ones. The first reservoir world appeared on the display. Designation Halvern Cluster, Body 7. The image resolved into a wireframe rendering of a vast blue-black ocean, sampled from orbit, a single data column scrolled beside it. Dense with numbers, Maya didn't need a translator to understand the implication of. This world hydrosphere, Director Pell intoned, contains an estimated 10 to the 23rd power individual viral particles per cubic kilometer of surface water, representing tens of thousands of distinct genetic lineages, the majority capable of horizontal gene transfer into any cellular organism they contact. Our sampler drone, sterilized to a level previously considered absolute, returned with measurable viral contamination on its hull within 4 minutes of surface contact. The drone was destroyed as a precaution. This is, by every metric we possess, the most densely viral environment ever cataloged. A low murmur moved through the chamber, dozens of species expressing dozens of forms of alarm. Maya stared at the number on the screen and did the conversion in her head, automatically, the way she'd once converted blood gas readings without thinking. 10 to the 23rd viral particles per cubic kilometer of ocean water. She'd read that number before. It was in a textbook. It was, as far as anyone on Earth had ever been able to determine, a fairly unremarkable estimate for the global ocean virome. The trillions upon trillions of bacteriophages and marine viruses that existed in every liter of seawater on the planet, quietly regulating bacterial populations, driving evolution, and doing absolutely nothing to the fish, the whales, or the people who swam in it. A coincidence, she told herself. It had to be. The second world replaced the first. Designation Calyx, third planet. The image showed a dense green canopy from orbit, and beneath it, a sampling readout that made several delegates physically recoil, their bodies contracting inward in postures Maya had learned, over 4 months, to recognize as disgust. This world surface biosphere, Pell continued, is dominated by an airborne fungal network capable of converting host biomass into reproductive structures within hours of exposure. Our sampler recorded spore concentrations of approximately 50,000 viable units per cubic meter of atmosphere at canopy level, rising to over 2 million per cubic meter within disturbed soil layers. Multiple insect analogs sampled from the canopy showed advanced stages of fungal takeover, their bodies repurposed entirely for spore distribution. This represents an active, self-propagating biological weapon at a planetary scale. Maya's pen, which she had picked back up without noticing, stopped again. 50,000 spores per cubic meter at canopy level. 2 million in soil. She had walked through forests with exactly those numbers, had, in fact, once spent a summer in Costa Rica cataloging the very organism the readout was almost certainly describing, a parasitic fungus that infected ants, hijacked their nervous systems, marched them to optimal humidity, and burst spore-producing stalks through their skulls. It was horrifying if you were an ant. It was a Tuesday if you were anyone else. The list continued, and with each new entry, the cold feeling in Maya's stomach deepened into something colder and more specific, a feeling she recognized from every moment in her career, when a diagnosis she didn't want to be true had clicked into place anyway. The third world's atmosphere carried an aerosolized bacterial load that Pell described as sufficient to colonize the respiratory tract of any breathing organism within seconds of inhalation, a number that matched, almost exactly, the bacterial content of a single breath of ordinary outdoor air on a humid day. The fourth world hosted what Pell called a mind-altering parasite of unprecedented sophistication, a single-celled organism capable of forming cysts in neural tissue and subtly altering host behavior to favor its own transmission, a description that fit, with uncomfortable precision, a parasite Maya had diagnosed dozens of times in immunocompromised patients, one carried by roughly a third of the human species at any given moment, with no symptoms at all in healthy adults. The Concordance's samplers were extraordinary instruments, Maya understood now, capable of detecting individual molecules of pathogen across interstellar distances, capable of returning data with a precision human science wouldn't achieve for centuries. But they had been built by a species that had never once needed to ask the question that mattered most. They had no concept of an immune system, because they had never had one, and so they had no framework for understanding an environment that could be saturated with pathogens and simultaneously be the environment that produced, sustained, and protected the very organisms living in it. A sampler that detected 10 to the 23rd viral particles in the ocean had no way of knowing that the organisms swimming through that ocean had co-evolved with every one of those particles for billions of years, that the relationship was not infection, it was conversation. And now the Concordance was about to file the same misdiagnosis against the planet where the conversation had been going on the longest. The final reservoir world appeared. Designation Sol, third planet. Pell's voice took on a note Maya hadn't heard from him before, something that in a human she might have called reluctance. This world presents an unusual complication, he said. Unlike the previous 9 reservoirs, this world hosts an organized technological civilization, currently a Concordance associate member. Our long-range samplers returned pathogenic saturation data consistent with, and in several categories exceeding, the combined readings of all 9 prior reservoirs. He paused, and the pause stretched long enough that several delegates shifted in their seats. The data suggests the civilization is not merely tolerating the saturation. It appears to be thriving within it, a result our models classify as statistically impossible. We believe the sampler data must be corrupted before Protocol Omega can be formally extended to this world. We request the data be re-verified. Maya cleared her throat, the sound dry and human, cut through the chamber's hum like a dropped instrument. Every delegate turned toward her. Dozens of sensory organs in dozens of configurations focusing on the small, soft, breathing creature from the unremarkable world currently displayed above their heads. Director Pell, she said, standing. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I'd like to request a verification survey, and I'd like to conduct it personally. Pell's translucent form turned toward her, slow and fluid, his internal organs shifting visibly with the motion. There was no hostility in the gesture, only the focused attention of a species encountering a variable it hadn't accounted for. Dr. Okonkwo, he said, his voice carrying the careful, gentle precision of someone explaining something to a person not expected to fully grasp it. Your species' biological tolerance is, candidly, a subject of considerable concern to this directorate. We had not intended to involve a human representative directly in a Protocol Omega verification survey, given the... He paused, searching for a word that wouldn't be an insult, given the elevated baseline risk. With respect, Director, Maya said, I'd argue that elevated baseline risk is exactly why I should be the one to go. Your samplers detect pathogens. They don't detect outcomes. I can tell you what those readings mean for the organisms living with them, because I've spent my career treating those organisms. If your data really does show my planet's biosphere is more saturated than the other 9 reservoirs combined, and my planet is, in your own data, thriving, then either your model is wrong or your definition of pathogenic is wrong. I'd like the chance to find out which. A ripple of attention moved through the chamber. Director Pell remained still for a long moment, his internal structures pulsing in slow patterns Maya had learned, over 4 months, corresponded to deep deliberation among the Vesari. Very well, he said finally, we will provide an escort. Senior Analyst Thesic will accompany you. He gestured, and the display shifted to show a sleek, segmented vessel, its hull a uniform matte white, broken only by rows of small circular apertures that Maya recognized, with a small internal lurch, as sterilization emitters. You will travel aboard the Lumen Vector, our most advanced biosurvey craft, capable of full atmospheric sampling without hull breach. He paused. His voice dropped into a register that carried, for the first time, something like a warning. But understand, Dr. Okonkwo, the survey will be conducted under full concordance verification protocols. Every reading will be logged automatically to a cumulative saturation index. If that index confirms our preliminary data, Protocol Omega will be enacted the moment the survey concludes, automatically, with no further deliberation required. There will be no second vote. Maya nodded slowly. Understood. When do we leave? The interior of the Lumen Vector was the cleanest space Maya had ever stood in, and she had stood in surgical theaters. Every surface gleamed with faint chemical sheen, the air itself carrying a sterile, scentless quality that felt less like an absence of smell and more like the deliberate erasure one. There were no seats, only smooth recessed alcoves lined with soft, faintly glowing material that conformed to the body. The only light came from the data displays lining every wall, an enormous forward viewport that dominated the front third of the vessel. Senior Analyst Thesic occupied the center of the cabin, suspended in a cradle of the same glowing material, his translucent body almost invisible against the white interior except for faint shadows of his internal organs. Unlike Director Pell, Thesic had not spoken since they departed the Concordance station, his attention fixed entirely on a floating data construct that hovered before him, dense with scrolling figures. He wore, Maya noticed, what appeared to be a secondary containment layer over his outer membrane, a faintly shimmering field that she suspected was some kind of additional sterilization barrier. He was not just here to observe. He was here protected. First coordinates transmitted, Maya said, and her voice sounded small in the cabin's hush. Thesic's cradle rotated slightly toward her, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and then the starfield in the viewport dissolved into the blue curve of Earth's atmosphere. The Lumen Vector's descent was smooth, almost gentle, a controlled glide that gave no sense of the speed Maya knew they were traveling at. The blue deepened, then resolved into open ocean, the Pacific stretching to every horizon. We're approaching the first sample zone now, Maya said. Open ocean, about 400 kilometers off the coast. This is about as representative a patch of seawater as you'll find anywhere on the planet. Thesic extended a sampling probe through a small aperture in the hull, a slender filament that descended into the water below without so much as a ripple disturbing the surface from their altitude. On his data construct, numbers began to populate, scrolling with the rapid precision of automated analysis. A new icon appeared, a stylized sphere representing the planet, with a single percentage glowing inside it, 4%. This sample confirms preliminary viral density readings, Thesic said, his voice a thinner, higher version of Pell's resonant hum. Approximately 10 to the 23rd individual viral particles per cubic kilometer, consistent across multiple genetic lineages. Saturation index, 4%. He transmitted the reading to the concordance station without further comment. The same flat, procedural tone Maya had heard from 100 lab technicians reading off blood panel results. Most of those are bacteriophages, Maya said. They infect bacteria, not multicellular organisms. They're actually one of the reasons the ocean stays healthy. They control bacterial blooms. Without them, the entire marine food web would collapse within weeks. Thesic did not respond, but Maya noticed his cradle had rotated almost imperceptibly, angling slightly toward the viewport, toward the vast blue expanse below, as though some small part of his attention had shifted from the data to the thing the data was supposedly describing. Next sample zone, Maya said. The lumen vector rose smoothly out of the marine layer and arced toward a different stretch of coastline, the deep blue giving way to the dense, textured green of tropical rainforest canopy. The vessel slowed, hovering at a height that put them just above the highest emergent trees, close enough that Maya could see individual leaves trembling in air currents she couldn't feel inside the sealed cabin. This is a section of equatorial rainforest, Maya said. Probably the densest concentration of fungal biomass you'll find anywhere on the surface. Thesic's sampling apertures open along the hull, and for a long moment nothing happened except the slow scroll of incoming data. Then his cradle went very still. Atmospheric spore density at canopy level, 52,000 viable units per cubic meter, he reported, his voice carrying the same flat precision, though Maya thought she detected, for the first time, something underneath it, a kind of strained quality, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. Soil air samples show spore density exceeding 2.1 million units per cubic meter. Multiple arthropod specimens within sensor range display advanced fungal colonization consistent with our calyx readings. The saturation index updated, 11%. That fungus, Maya said gently, mostly only affects insects. There's a different species for nearly every species of ant in this forest, each one extremely specialized. It's actually a textbook example of evolutionary specificity, not an uncontrolled spread. The forest has had these fungi for tens of millions of years. It's still here. It's the most productive biome on the planet. Thesic's data construct flickered, briefly, a stutter in the scrolling figures that resolved itself a half-second later. He said nothing. Next sample zone, Maya said. The third stop took them over open grassland, where a herd of grazing animals moved in a loose formation across a golden plain. Thesic's reading here focused on the airborne bacterial content, a figure that climbed the saturation index to 19%, accompanied by a brief, almost embarrassed pause before he reported that the bacterial species detected appeared to be, in his words, broadly distributed across the entire sampled atmosphere of the planet, rather than localized to the specific region. Maya didn't need to explain that one. She let the silence sit. The fourth stop was a small farmhouse on the edge of the grassland, where Thesic reported with what Maya was now fairly sure was genuine discomfort. Neural cyst formations consistent with the calyx parasite readings were detected in approximately 1 in 3 of the small domesticated felines observed in the area, and his voice paused for a fraction a second longer than data transmission required. In an estimated 30% of the human population, sampled via atmospheric trace. Analysis. Toxoplasma, Maya said. It's a parasite. Cats are its primary host, but it can infect almost any warm-blooded animal, including us. About a third of the global population is carrying it right now. Most people never know. It doesn't cause symptoms in healthy adults. The The saturation index ticked up to 31%. Thesik's cradle had gone almost entirely still, his translucent form catching the cabin lights at an angle that made his internal structures look, for the first time since they'd left the station, faintly agitated. "I do not understand," Thesik said, and it was the first thing he had said that wasn't a direct data report. His voice was quieter now, the resonant hum thinned almost to a whisper. "A parasite capable of forming cysts in neural tissue is present in nearly a third of the species' population, and this is described to me as causing no symptoms. In healthy people, yes," Maya said, "the immune system keeps it in a kind of permanent stalemate. Most people live their entire lives never knowing they have it." "A stalemate," Thesik repeated, as though testing the word for a hidden flaw. Maya didn't answer. She had a feeling, watching the slow agitation ripple through his internal organs, that he wasn't really asking her. The 5th and 6th stops moved quickly, a hospital in a mid-sized city, where Thesik's readings of antimicrobial-resistant bacterial strains on common surfaces pushed the index to 44%, accompanied by a brief, halting note that the readings were, quote, broadly consistent across all sampled urban environments on the planet, rather than localized to medical facilities and a coastal wetland, where a sample of the local mud returned bacterial diversity figures that, Thesik reported, exceeded the entire cataloged bacterial diversity of every other concordance member world combined, in a single handful of sediment. The index climbed to 58%. Through all of it, Maya kept her voice level, the same calm, explanatory tone she'd used in 100 consultations with frightened patients and frightened families. She wasn't arguing. She was narrating. She talked about coevolution, about the difference between presence and harm, about the trillions of microorganisms that lived on and inside every human body at every moment of every day, about gut flora and skin biomes and the invisible ecosystems that every multicellular organism on the planet carried with it everywhere it went, not as contamination, but as a part of itself. She wasn't making a case. She was describing the ground beneath their feet, the same way she might describe it to a first-year medical student who just looked at a blood smear for the first time and panicked. Before the 7th sample, Maya hesitated, her hand hovering over the coordinate input. There was one more stop she hadn't planned to include, one that she suspected would matter more than any of the others, though she couldn't yet have explained why. She transmitted a set of coordinates for a small primary school on the outskirts of coastal town, a low cluster building surrounding an open playground where, even from orbit, Maya could make out dozens of small moving figures, bright colors against green grass. Thesik's sampling apertures opened, and the data construct filled almost instantly with a density of readings unlike anything from the previous stops, not because any single category spiked dramatically, but because every category spiked at once, in overlapping waves. The way ripples from a dozen stones thrown into the same pond would cross and recross each other until the surface of the water was nothing but interference. This location returns the highest aggregate biological transfer rate of the survey so far, Thesik said, his voice carrying a note of genuine bewilderment now, a quality that, Maya thought, sounded almost like the voice of someone trying to read a sentence written in a language they'd only just begun to learn. 41 distinct juvenile host organisms detected within a confined outdoor area, engage in continuous, repeated, close physical contact. Respiratory particulate exchange rate exceeds the airport sample by a factor 3. Cross-contamination of skin and oral microbiomes between individual hosts is occurring at a rate our models would classify, in any other context, as a controlled exposure experiment designed to deliberately accelerate pathogen transmission between subjects. That's recess, Maya said. Thesik's cradle turned slightly, an almost imperceptible motion, toward the viewport, toward the small bright figures running and shouting and falling and getting back up on the grass below. The biological status panels for these juvenile organisms, he said slowly, after a moment, indicate. He stopped, started again. They indicate ongoing immune system development consistent with, he searched the term with training, as though the exposure itself is necessary, as though a juvenile host deprived of this level of pathogen exchange to develop. He paused again, less effectively. That's exactly right, Maya said. Kids who grow up around more germs, more dirt, more other kids, tend to have fewer allergies and autoimmune problems later in life. There's a whole field of research about it. We used to think dirt was just dirt. Turns out it's curriculum. The saturation index, which had been climbing steadily, climbed faster now, the number ticking past its previous high before settling at 88%, just shy of the airport reading but layered, Maya noticed, with a far wider spread of pathogen categories, dozens of distinct signatures overlapping in a single small patch of grass and asphalt. Thesick said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier precision entirely. "You are telling me," he said, "that this civilization does not merely tolerate what we have been measuring. It deliberately exposes its own offspring to it, as a form of—" He stopped, and Maya thought she heard, for the first time, something that might have been the beginning of genuine awe underneath the unease, as a form of care. For the seventh sample, Maya transmitted coordinates for a location well inland, a small regional airport on the outskirts of a mid-sized city. Thesick's sampling apertures opened, and for a long moment the cabin was silent, except for the faint hum of the ship's systems. Then an alarm sounded, a thin, discordant tone Maya hadn't heard before, and Thesick's cradle jerked, an involuntary motion that sent a ripple through his translucent body. "Atmospheric sample returns," he said, and his voice had changed entirely now. The flat precision gone, replaced by something tight and strained. "Biological particulate density at this location exceeds every previous reading by a factor of—" He stopped. Multiple distinct pathogen signatures detected simultaneously. Viral, bacterial, fungal, all present in concentrations consistent with active transmission events. He paused again, longer this time. Population density readings indicate approximately 4,000 individual hosts within immediate sensor range, in continuous close proximity, exchanging respiratory particulate at a rate that our models classify as. He stopped a third time, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped almost to a whisper, an active superspreader event. Multiple active superspreader events. Simultaneously, in the same enclosed structure. "It's an airport," Maya said. "It's like this all the time." The saturation index spiked, climbing past 60, past 70, the number scrolling too fast to read individually before settling, finally, at 79%. Through the viewport, Maya could see the building below them, a low sprawl of glass and steel, tiny figures moving across the tarmac, and through the terminal's windows, oblivious, the way people always were, to the invisible storm of biology surrounding every breath they took. "Final sample zone," Maya said. For the final stop, Maya didn't choose a location. She gave Thesick a different kind of coordinate, a frequency, a request of the lumen vector sensors to perform a full biological scan not of an environment, but of a single organism, herself. Thesick's cradle went rigid. "The concordance survey protocols," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been alarm, "do not include direct biological scanning of survey personnel." "I'm aware," Maya said. "I'm requesting it anyway. You spent the last hour measuring environments my species lives inside. I think it's worth measuring what my species lives with, inside us, all the time. If your saturation index is supposed to represent the total pathogenic burden faced by my civilization, then it's incomplete without this data. By your own standards, that makes everything you recorded so far an invalid dataset." There was a long silence. Maya watched Thesick's internal structures pulse in slow, deliberate patterns, the visible architecture of a species working through a logical knot it had never encountered before. Finally, with what looked, even on an alien body, unmistakably like reluctance, he extended a secondary sensor array, a soft cone of pale light that washed over Maya from head to toe. The data construct before him filled, instantly, with more numbers than any previous reading had produced, an entire architecture of scrolling figures that seemed to keep multiplying the longer the scan ran. "Internal microbial population," Thesick said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "Approximately 38 trillion individual bacterial organisms, representing over 1,000 distinct species, distributed across the digestive tract, skin surface, and respiratory passages." He paused. "Latent viral genomes detected within host cellular DNA, consistent with multiple historical retroviral integration events, present in every cell of the host body for the host's entire lifetime. Active viral populations detected in oral and nasal passages, consistent with at least 3 distinct common pathogens currently in a dormant or low-activity state. Parasitic cyst signature detected in neural tissue, consistent with the toxoplasma reading from sample 4. He stopped. The data construct continued scrolling, faster now, the saturation index climbing past the previous reading at the airport, past 80, past 90, the numbers no longer settling into any kind of stable figure, climbing instead in a continuous, uninterrupted line. This organism, Thesic said, and Maya heard, for the first time, something in his voice that was unmistakably fear, contains within itself a pathogenic load exceeding every previous reading taken on this survey, including the airport sample, including the wetland sample, including the combined readings of all 9 prior reservoir worlds. By every metric this director possesses, this organism should not exist. It should have been dead before it finished forming. And yet, he stopped again. On the data construct, beneath the still climbing saturation index, a second readout had appeared. One Maya recognized immediately, because she'd looked at versions of 1,000 times in her career. A biological status panel, heart rate, respiration, core temperature, immune markers, all of them displayed in the calm, steady green that any doctor on Earth would recognize as the universal color of nothing to worry about. And yet, Thesic said again, "Quieter now, you are well." "I'm well," Maya agreed. The cabin fell into a silence, unlike any of the silences before it. Thesic's translucent body had gone almost completely still, his internal organs barely moving, the data construct before him no longer scrolling, but simply hanging in the air, frozen on the impossible numbers it had produced. Through the viewport, Earth turned beneath them blue and white and achingly ordinary. The same world it had been an hour ago, the same world it had been for 4 billion years, utterly unaware that it had just broken the most sophisticated biological threat model in the galaxy simply by existing. Saturation index, Thesic said finally, and his voice had become something Maya hadn't heard from any Vesari before, not the flat precision of data reporting, not the careful gentleness of Director Pell's earlier explanations, but something raw, something that sounded, despite everything, almost human. The index reads 141%. The number is impossible, Maya said, which means the scale is wrong. Thesic turned his cradle toward her, fully. For the first time since they left the station, his internal structure is shifting in patterns that, on a Vesari, Maya was beginning to suspect represented something very close to what a human face did when it was trying not to fall apart. The core axiom of the saturation index, he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him something, is that pathogenic load above a certain threshold is incompatible with organismal survival. It is a foundational principle of every biological assessment this directorate has ever made. He looked at the still glowing green status panel, at the calm, steady numbers describing a living, breathing, healthy human being carrying a pathogenic load that, by every model the Vesari possessed, should not be survivable by anything. The index says you should not be alive, Dr. Okonkwo, and you are. He paused. I do not know what that means for the model. I do not know what that means for the other 9 reservoirs. I do not know what that means for us. It means, Maya said gently, that you've been measuring the wrong thing. You've been measuring presence. What you actually need to measure is relationship. My body isn't fighting a war against 38 trillion bacteria. It's running a civilization with them. They digest my food. They train my immune system. Some of them make vitamins I can't produce on my own. The viruses embedded in my DNA aren't an infection anymore. They're part of the genome that makes me human in the first place. None of this is a battle I'm losing. It's not a battle at all. It's just, she searched for the word, it's just life. This is what life looks like when it's been doing this for billions of years. Thesic didn't respond immediately. On his data construct, Maya watched something she hadn't expected. The saturation index, that impossible 141%, began to flicker, and then slowly lines of code began scrolling beneath it, the concordance's analytical matrix cross-referencing its own findings against itself, searching for the error that had to be there, the corrupted reading, the sensor fault, the explanation that would make the number make sense again. It found none. One by one, the matrix began flagging its own prior conclusions instead. The calyx fungal reading, flagged. The Halvern viral density, flagged. Every reading from every reservoir world. Every number that had seemed so absolute an hour ago, now marked with the same small, quiet symbol, a query, a question the matrix had never been built to ask before. Contextual interpretation required. Threat Designation pending review. The Matrix is rebuilding its own framework in real time, Desic said, and there was something in his voice now that Maya could only describe as wonder, layered uneasily over something that was still, unmistakably, fear. It has encountered a result that violates its founding principle, and rather than discard the result, it is discarding the principle. He turned to look at the viewport again, at the blue and white world below, and Maya thought, not for the first time, that there was something almost beautiful about watching a mind, even an alien one, encounter a truth too large for its old shape and choose, instead of breaking, to grow. The saturation index vanished from the display entirely. In its place, after a long moment, a new classification appeared, rendered in the Vasari's cool blue script. Designation Soul. 3. Reclassification pending. Provisional status. Integrated biosphere. Host microbiome symbiotic equilibrium. Below it, where the threat percentage had been, a single phrase glowed in soft, steady white. Model insufficient. Further study required. The Lumen vector broke orbit 40 minutes later. By the time Maya stepped back on the floor of the Concordance assembly chamber, the great display at its center no longer showed 10 glowing nodes orbiting a seal-marked plague protocol Omega. It showed instead a single slowly rotating image of Earth, and beside it, the same phrase Thesic's matrix had produced. Model insufficient. Further study required. The chamber was filled with a low murmur unlike any Maya had heard before, not alarm, but something closer to the sound of 100 species quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew. Director Pell did not look at her directly when he spoke, and Maya understood by now that this wasn't coldness. For the Vasari, looking at someone while admitting an error would have made the error personal, and what mattered to them was never who had been wrong, only what was now known to be true. Our Directorate's threat models, Pell said, his voice carrying that same thin, resonant hum, but slower now, more careful, have operated for 11,000 years on a single foundational assumption, that pathogenic presence is, by definition, pathogenic harm. Today's survey has demonstrated that this assumption does not hold universally. He paused, and his translucent form shifted, his internal organs settling into a configuration Maya hadn't seen before, one that looked, for the first time, less like a creature observing a threat, and more like one looking at something it didn't have a word for yet. We have been measuring the wrong variable for 11,000 years. He turned toward his aides, a cluster of smaller, translucent forms waiting at the edge of the chamber. All 10 reservoir designations are suspended pending full reevaluation under a new framework. We must learn, he said, and the word seemed to cost him something, to measure not what an environment contains, but what an organism has become alongside it. Later, on the observation deck of the human embassy, Maya stood beside Thesic, who had requested, to the visible surprise of his own delegation, to accompany her there rather than return immediately to his quarters. He stood near the viewport, his translucent body catching the soft starlight, and for a long time neither of them spoke. I have surveyed worlds that could dissolve this vessel's hull in seconds, Thesic said finally, his voice quiet, stripped of the strained quality it had carried during the survey, replaced by something more contemplative. I have cataloged atmospheres that would end my life the instant I was exposed to them. Those readings never frightened me. They were simply facts about places. He turned his head slightly, his attention drifting toward the curve of Earth below, the slow turn of blue and white and green. What frightened me today was not a place. It was you, standing in front of me, breathing normally, carrying inside your single body more active pathogens than any environment we have ever surveyed, and being, by every measurable standard, fine. Maya thought about it for a moment. She thought about every patient she'd ever treated, every chart she'd ever read, every time she explained to a frightened parent that the swab they'd just watched her run across their child's throat would come back showing dozens of species of bacteria, and that this was not a diagnosis. It was just what a throat was. She thought about how many times, over 15 years, she had looked at numbers that would have meant a death sentence anywhere else and written, calmly, in the chart, within normal limits. I think, she said slowly, that the difference between a threat and a body is mostly just time. Given enough of it, almost anything can stop being a war and start being a roommate. Thesic didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone very quiet, almost himself. 11,000 years, he said, And we never once asked how long is enough. He was quiet again after that, for long enough that Maya thought the conversation had ended, that he had retreated back into whatever internal architecture the Vasari used to process things too large to say out loud. But after a while, he spoke again, and this time his voice had a different quality entirely, something almost tentative, the voice of someone asking a question they were a little afraid to hear the answer to. When your species first encountered these organisms, he said, the ones living inside you, the bacteria, the dormant viruses, the parasite in your neural tissue, was there a time before you understood what they were? A time when you might have looked at the same readings I looked at today and felt what I felt? Maya thought about that for a moment. She thought about the history she'd studied in medical school, the long, slow centuries before anyone on Earth had known that disease wasn't punishment or miasma or curse. The moment someone first looked through a crude lens and saw, swimming in a drop of pond water, something alive that had no business being alive, something that shouldn't have existed by any framework anyone had at the time. She thought about how long it had taken after that, how many wrong guesses, how many treatments that made things worse, how many centuries of looking at the human body as a battlefield, every illness and invasion, every feverish siege. Yes, she said, it took us a very long time to stop being afraid of what was inside us. Longer, honestly, than it took us to understand most of the universe outside us. There's something about looking inward that's harder than looking outward. Maybe because outward, if something's wrong, you can leave. Inward, there's nowhere to go. You just have to learn to live there. Thesik's translucent body shifted, a slow ripple moving through his internal structures, and Maya had the strange sense, watching it, that she was witnessing something settle into place inside him, the way a bone sets after a fracture, not back to exactly what it had been, but into something that will hold weight differently from now on. My people have never been sick, he said, quietly, not once, in our entire recorded history. We built everything, our cities, our ships, our laws, our entire understanding of what life is, around the absence of a single thing we have never experienced. He turned from the viewport to look at her directly, and Maya understood that for a Vasari, this was not a small gesture. Today I learned that the absence was not safety. It was only ever a different kind of unfamiliarity. He paused. I do not know yet what it means to build a civilization around relationship instead of an absence. But I think, perhaps, it means something closer to what I saw on that playground than to anything in our threat models. Below them, Earth continued its slow turn, blue and green and white, indifferent, as it had always been, to the conversations happening in the dark above it, going on exactly as it had for 4 billion years, full of trillions of small lives living inside trillions of other small lives, none of them keeping score, none of them at war, all of them, somehow, simply continuing. Maya looked out at it with him for a while, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she didn't feel the need to say anything else. Some conversations she had learned a long time ago, in quiet rooms at 3 a.m, with families who had just been told something they weren't ready to hear, didn't need to be finished. They just needed enough silence afterward for the new shape of things to settle in,